So let's see what happens if the tax is imposed on workers instead. In this case, the worker, instead of the firm, would be the one cutting the check to the government physically. Although the tax is technically being paid by a different party, the overall outcome is the same. The important thing to remember is that regardless of whether the tax is placed on firms or workers, the burden of the tax is shared between both. If the tax is imposed on workers, it will shift the supply curve up and to the left, or decreasing the supply. At this level of employment, workers will want wage W0. So now if they have to pay $1 out of their paycheck just to work, they'll have to receive W0 plus 1 in order to keep working. This creates a wedge between how much the workers are paid by the firm and how much they take home. The labor market equilibrium then shifts from point A to point B. The firm ends up paying a higher wage, W1. The workers receive W1 minus 1 because this time they're the one paying the tax. So we end up in the same place, no matter which side pays the tax. We've now seen how payroll taxes impact both firms and workers. In both cases, the total burden of the tax is shared between them, depending on how responsive each side is to changes in wages. Whether the tax is imposed on firms or workers, the main takeaway is that the cost gets split between the two parties. So the key here is that who pays the tax directly, who writes the check to the government, doesn't necessarily determine who bears the real burden. That's determined by how flexible supply and demand are. The true incidence of the payroll tax, or who bears the real cost of the payroll tax, is not determined by who physically pays it, but rather it's determined in the competitive labor market. Now, we've seen how payroll taxes are typically shared between firms and workers, but now let's look at an extreme case where workers pay the entire tax themselves. Now, what would it take for the workers to be the only ones to bear any of the costs of this? Perfectly inelastic labor supply curve is what it will take. A perfectly inelastic labor supply curve means that the quantity of labor that workers are willing to supply does not change no matter what the wage level. Workers will continue to supply the same amount of labor, even if wages increase or if they didn't decrease. So an example might be a highly specialized medical profession like surgeons. If a region only has a few surgeons and the number of surgeries needed is high, those surgeons will continue working the same hours or work extra hours, regardless of changes in pay. They're committed to the work because it's vital and there are so few people with the necessary skills. But obviously, the only time this will actually happen is if the skills are extremely rare and these market things are localized, and I doubt it will last for very long. They may be willing to keep this up in the short term despite a drop in wages, but they won't over the long term. So in these extreme situations, why do the workers face all the tax incidents? So in this case, regardless of the wage, E0 workers are employed. So right here, because the supply curve is a vertical line, it's always going to be E0 number of workers employed. As the demand curve shifts downwards, the wages paid will fall by $1, but the level of employment will not at all. So if this is so rare, why should we care about this? If it's only going to last for, a short period of time in very small, very localized, specialized labor markets. It's because this gives us an important idea. When the labor supply curve is inelastic, relatively inelastic, meaning that the labor supply curve is less responsive to a change in wages. So not a perfectly vertical line, but it has a pretty steep slope. In those situations, more of the incidence of the payroll tax will fall on the workers. The labor supply curves for men tend to be more inelastic. So a payroll tax on men is mostly borne by these workers. It's not borne by the firms paying them because they're going to keep working. On the other hand, the labor supply curves for teenagers and people over 65, they tend to be much more elastic. For them, relatively little of the tax is being paid by them because they will respond to the tax by leaving the market. So instead of facing lower wages, they primarily just have lower employment from these taxes.